far as the Connaught Tunnel is concerned, uh, the removal of the second track took place some years after I left there, and I don't know why. I can only imagine that it's because it's cheaper to keep up one track than it is to keep up two. And the other thing, perhaps, is that while it is a big hole, there's quite a lot of room in it. With two tracks, obviously the clearance is somewhat limited. You know, the tunnel is roughly a hemisphere. And I do remember one time at Glacier when a westbound train came roaring out of there, and near the head end they had a gondola car which was loaded with auto truck frames stacked on end, upright, you know. And I think the track must have been a bit rough or something like that, and the car was swaying back and forth, and one of these frames caught, and the whole carload flipped out, just like a deck of cards, you know. They all flipped out one after another, went shooting out of the tunnel, and just by the grace of God, I suppose, that the train wasn't derailed or anything. They all went this way and that way, you know, but it is marvelous, all these big iron frames shooting out of there, and it didn't do any damage except to the frames. Cost a little money, I suppose, for claims. But this was one of the reasons, I guess. This was a problem of clearance, and now freight cars are being loaded with higher loads and so on and so forth. So this would be an advantage, therefore, to have a track with higher clearance. Again, the double track there was, at that time, a tremendous advantage to single-track railroading, because trains working on time orders would be planning to make double track to meet an opposing train on a schedule, you know. As soon as they were able to make the end of double track between Ross Peak and Glacier, that is on the west hill, they were in the clear. Then they had about 8 miles of passing track, you might as well say. And this was a tremendous advantage to the dispatchers. They always used to hold out tempting weights at one end or the other of double track, so that an opposing freight train would be able to make it for a passenger train, you know, and this would really give them a big advantage. I mean, you might even pass two trains on that short stretch of double track. But now with centralized train control, with the dispatcher controlling the trains automatically, and also with fewer trains because of longer trains, and without the necessity of running pushers back against the opposing traffic, you see, there must be fewer trains. So I guess it's not really necessary. Anyway, double track is sort of outmoded. I mean, the trend is towards single track.
I suppose the only trouble would be now if you had a smash up in the tunnel, it would be really blocked.
Yes, that's right. That's right. If there was something went wrong in the tunnel, you wouldn't have the advantage of being able to single track it, as we say, use the other track, or to run trains around it, or to work from the other track onto, you know, the opposite, the other track. So it has disadvantages.
Well, the other thing that I had in mind, you mentioned once these tunnel track walkers. They spend the best part of their working lives underground, I guess.
Yeah, they're real troglodytes. Actually, they were wonderful fellows. You know, there was a fellow there, a good friend of mine named Walter Welby, and I would certainly like to see him again. I understand he's still alive. Walter was a tunnel track walker, and they used to work then 6 days a week, and they were supposed to work an 8-hour shift, but I think for a long while there, they're working 12-hour shifts, which made it pretty tough. But they walked, on their shift, they walked 5 miles eastward from Glacier to Connaught, and then they walked 5 miles back from Connaught to Glacier, and that constituted their tour of duty. And however, because they didn't get too many days off, and they would generally arrange sometimes to take a little time off and double up for one another, just like the operators used to do there, so that they could have 2 days at a time. Walter, of course, was a Swede. Walter Welby came from the island of Gotland, where he said that all the babies were raised on cod liver oil and whiskey. And naturally, he lost his taste for cod liver oil, I think, but never for whiskey or any version of alcohol. And he didn't He was not by any means an alcoholic, but when he went on a bender, he went on a real Scandinavian bender, you know, and he would just gobble up everything in sight until it was all gone, and there was no more that he could possibly get. He was a real enthusiast. And I can remember one occasion when Walter went on about a 3-day bender, and most of the time he'd forget to eat very much during this. And he finally went back to work, and he was, well, relatively sober, I guess, but he hadn't had anything to eat for a long time, and he went in the tunnel, and he worked a 24-hour shift straight. And I saw him when he came out of the tunnel, in fact. He was absolutely black. He was coal black, you know, and the whites of his eyes looked startlingly white. It's really funny how black you could get in that damn place from the smoke of the trains and so on. And in fact, that time I went home with him for some reason or other to his place, and this was what amazed me. He hadn't had anything to eat for at least 30 hours, I suppose. And he went in, the first thing he did was to get this great big iron frying pan out, get the stove going. He puts us on the stove, and he carves up some old boiled potatoes and some salt pork. You know that, the salt pork, it's like. And that's what the first thing he put in his stomach. It would have killed an ordinary guy, you know, but then he went to bed and he slept. I don't know. The other tunnel watchman I remember very well was a little, very short, chunky, bulldog-type fellow called, his real name was Leon Turkala, and the CPR had got it a little mixed up, so on their payroll and their records he was Turkala Leon. You know, I think this is because of the European method of generally writing the family name first and the Christian name second. So anyway, once you're recorded with a CPR as being something, of course, that's it. It's final. That supersedes everything. However, this didn't affect him very much. He knew what his name was, and he knew which side was up. He used to drink on festive occasions like Christmas and New Year, you know, and I always had to go down there and have some scotch with him. He drank Old Parr, which is a little heavy to me, but one of the things you had to do when you went there and you started drinking scotch, you always drank it straight in large water tumblers, you know. He'd pour out a full tumbler full, and of course he'd be quite insulted if you didn't drink it all, naturally. But he sort of cushioned the shock by insisting that you eat with it. And he used to make the most delicious meat. I don't know how he cooked it, but he had a huge pot, and it was always full of large bones or joints, as my grandmother used to call them, you know, with succulent meat on them. And so you grabbed one of these and gnawed at it and drank scotch, which was something new to me, but I found it very agreeable. And none of these people had much of a life, actually. Life in Glacier was rather peculiar. It was great. The people who had families there, you know, because you were preoccupied with your own children and so on. But for the bachelor there, it must have been something like the original, I don't know whether it's a CPR invention, but the Chinese railway construction worker in BC who came out and labored and labored and labored, and at I don't know what per hour, maybe about 5 cents, and wasn't allowed by our far-seeing government to bring out his family, you know, or to have any kind of life at all except in the service of our great country. A great country being represented by our great railway, the Canadian Pacific. And, well, so much for the tunnel watchman. You know, Jack, there's something that's non-railroading anyway. I don't know whether this is interesting or not, but as a mountaineer anyway, I sort of owe all my mountaineering to A.A. McCoubrey, whom I was lucky enough to meet when I was first up in field in 1929, and he was at that time quite a well-known mountaineer and explorer, and had been president of the Alpine Club of Canada, and later was the editor of the Journal of the Alpine Club of Canada, and so on and so forth. And he captured me as a backpacker eventually. You know, he was looking for young people who were interested in ski mountaineering, because he was trying to get ski mountaineering off the ground in Canada. And it's hard to believe now, but there was a great deal of conservatism which tended to make all faithful alpinists believed that this was in for a dig, as it was too frivolous, It wasn't it wasn't in accord with the serious aims of members of the Alpine Club, It was rather undignified. McCoubrey he was a pretty sporty fellow, and he thought that was all bosh, and he was the one who started the first ski camp that the Alpine Club Canada ever had, and in fact I was intimately associated with him, usually in a rather laborious position, because I was backpacking. We had to backpack everything on skis for these first camps, at any rate. However, this is all by the way, because through McCoubrey, I met his son, who was a couple of years younger than myself, and young Alec McCoubrey, and another Winnipeg lad, Harry Kearns, whom we used to call Zeke for some unknown reason, and I did a tremendous lot of backpacking on these various expeditions, which developed later on. Alec was a victim of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia covers a multitude of mental aberrations, I think, and I'm not very well up on such things, but sometime, I think it was about the last big expedition we had, Alec showed a few vagrant symptoms of something being wrong, with his psyche or whatever it is, and turned out in the end that he was definitely off, to the point where his mother, after his father's death, his mother had him committed to Selkirk Mental Hospital for, well, as she said, he was threatening her life. Now, I don't know how serious he was about it. I never was afraid of him, but I must say he used to get in some towering rages. Well, he spent a session in Selkirk Mental Hospital. Whether it did him any good or bad, I don't know. But eventually, again, Alec showed up when I was in Glacier. Yes, he was, naturally, he was crazy about mountains. I mean, all mountaineers are. They wouldn't be there. And he came naturally enough to stay with me. And my wife was not the least bit afraid of me or just about anything else that crawls or flies or walks on two legs. So I was quite terrified by Alec, and he stayed there for a week or so, and then she huffily packed up and took the children and went off to stay with a friend in Calgary until Alec had gone away, which was a switch. I mean, you make the best of everything, and it wasn't too bad. Well, Alec, of course, was busy climbing all the mountains around Glacier. He'd climb a new peak every day. And the only one he wouldn't climb for some reason, some superstitious reason that he had, that was purely personal with him, was Mount Sir Donald. And he kept pressing me to climb it with him, which I eventually did. But I'm not going to go in that now. It was a rather peculiar climb. We climbed it anyway quite successfully and came down. But what I did want to say was this. If Alec had a marvelous diary, and he asked me or allowed me to read it while he was there. He recorded everything. And unfortunately, the diary got lost. Now, when he was there, for some reason, I don't know whether it was prescience or what, I thought, gee, some of these things are really terrific, and they're purely Alec and nobody else. They're completely mad in a way, and yet they're almost sane. And I wrote them down, and I'm glad I did. And I just wondered what you think about this. This always strikes me as something very strange, and I wish I could write like Alec, but you listen to it, and I hope, I mean, I'm not very good at reciting things, but I think I'll start on the one. This is an excerpt from his diary, which concerns an early exploration that his father and a man from Winnipeg named Graham Cairns, and young Alec made up the North Fork of the Illecillewaet from Albert Canyon. And this was a fairly formidable trip, and he was quite a young boy. So anyway, this is what he put in his diary when he was giving this account. One night I was aroused from slumber by Graham's mysterious activity at the back of the cabin. He was chopping along the table on which our grub had been placed with one of these ferocious-looking weapons which were mentioned previously. His mutterings of surliness rent the atmosphere alive with a poignant variety of obsolete words, in his endeavor to exterminate a pack rat who had attempted to chew his cud on our meager supply of food. After Graham's activity had subsided, we found that the tail of the pack rat had been left behind in evidence of his presence. While I had never glimpsed the small, despicable rodent, at no time did I doubt the authenticity of Graham's version as to what actually did happen. Imagine a tailless pack rat returning to pursue his life with others of his breeding. The friends of Mr. Pack Rat no doubt thought that, like Gilbert, who wrote the words for the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, how quaint the ways of paradox. I think that's wonderful, you know? It's, his evaluation of words is just a little bit off, and you don't know whether he's actually putting you on or whether he doesn't know, or really, it leaves you up in the air, you know? You're not sure. Whether this is characteristic of all people who suffer from schizophrenia, I don't know, but I have a notion that they do have this tendency. Someone told me that this is a characteristic of them. But his writing is, you see, it's good. It's got rhythm. For instance, the first thing is re-incident 1937. Mr. Gerard one afternoon was skiing down from MacArthur Pass, and having failed to follow the tracks of the other skiers, found himself winging his way 40 feet over a cliff. Giving vent to a shriek of avarice, he landed intact, but doubtless not on his feet, having found himself without broken bones or physical injuries. The only thing being broken was his thermos bottle, and Mr. Gerard can thank Providence it wasn't more than his thermos. You know, this thing, the shriek of avarice, of course, you know, this is fine. But I don't know. Alec had such strange faculty for mixing things up, and you always had to, because he wasn't a fool. I mean, he was quite an intelligent person, as you can see. I mean, I don't know. I just feel sorry that he...
Too bad the diary was lost.
Oh, this was a tragedy, because his diary was fantastic, and it covered... It would have been a very valuable document in mountaineering history, I think. I mean, obviously, you can tell from this kind of writing that it perhaps was imprecise, but it covered so much. I mean, the Rockies, the Selkirks, exploration trips, you know, that have pretty well sunk into darkness now. I mean, if there's anything on them, it's just the bare bones and so on. And this is all gone. And all this kind of thing would have been very valuable to a researcher. I mean, you know how popular research is. Everything eventually gets researched.
Which is what we're doing now.
Which is what we're doing now, I suppose, to some extent. Well, I don't know. Life in Glacier was quite different than I think it must be anywhere now. I mean, I don't know. It's, you know, there's such an easy transition from through time. I mean, until you arrive at a different condition altogether, and you look back and you wonder how different it was. But to live in a community of 60 people and to be cut off from, you know, traveling at your whim by highway. I mean, we had trains and that's all. Well, so we weren't cut off. But in other ways we were. We had radio, and so we were connected with the outside world, you know, at all times more or less by listening to our radio sets. But what you did there, you know, you were always preparing for the winter. The year was just the same, 12 months long as it is here. But summer was July and August. The winter started at the end of September. It almost invariably started to snow. I mean, that is to say, snow which stayed permanently by October 1st. It was fairly precise. It didn't vary very much. And from October the 1st until May the 15th, you could figure there'd be snow on the ground, so that almost everyone, except a few old-timers who used snowshoes, almost everyone was like myself, on skis from middle of October until the middle of May. And this in itself gives you a different view of life. I mean, just the mere fact that you don't walk but you ski, I mean, you glide instead of stepping, I think it does something to your feelings about everything, and it's a different form of locomotion. And of course then, obviously, knowing that you're going to have winter for over 8 months, you have to prepare for it. I mean, we didn't have any gas lines or oil lines or anything like that. We had to use coal or wood, and most people would get in some coal. You absolutely had to get that in and store it in your basement before the winter, and then a certain amount of wood, and some people used quite a lot. So difficult to get wood because in the park you weren't allowed to go out and cut trees unless you received a permit from the park warden, who was very lenient, but it could only be for cutting down dead trees. We used to do this in the springtime, and we'd go out and spend long hours up the hillsides felling these dead trees, which were in fact standing in about 8 feet of solid snow, and then you'd fell them on a steep hillside and cut them up in blocks, roll the blocks down, and then put them on a sleigh and drag them home, and a very primitive life. But there was something romantic about it, if one felt romantic, in a sort of a Wordsworthian sense. Anyway, I was always conscious of the romance of it. I don't know what it was.
You mentioned you used to ski to work. Was the town site a little bit?
Yeah, well, there was, the town was really divided in two. There was a sort of Shaughnessy Heights or Snob Hill area, you might call it, because there were, right across from the station, which was, I guess, about the main part of town, the station was on the south side, right on the banks of the Illecillewaet. And there was a little footbridge across to the post office and store on the north bank, almost opposite the station. North of the station, there was the yard, Glacier Yard, the tracks, the Y, which, because the valley was so narrow, had its tail right in a tunnel, in a short tunnel in the mountain, with, incidentally, a snow shed over it also, because there was a slide came down there every few years. And across the tracks also were a few houses owned by the CPR. Some people lived there, and some family lived in a store and a house near the store. But then behind the entrance and above the entrance to Connaught Tunnel, there was a flat, and quite a number of people, most of the people lived up there. That also was where the school was. So anyone living up there, which was about half a mile, I say, from the station, either skied or snowshoed whenever they came down to get their groceries at the store and the mail, the post office, or to pick up their milk and such like things which came in every day on a passenger train. And, it made for quite a communal life. You see, absolutely everybody saw everybody quite frequently, at the post office, at the store, and this is good. It was, in fact, a good community because I think a town of that size, a settlement of that size, can be absolutely poisonous if you have the wrong people and you get off on a basis, which I have seen where people have a lot of dogs and somebody's dog bites somebody else's little boy, and then, they start feuding with one another, and it curdles everything. But we were lucky. We had the storekeeper and his wife were fine people, and they were not by any means narrow. They were hardworking and they were generous. The park warden and his wife were people of culture and intelligence, and we had a good community. I mean, we had discussion, sort of just a little society where we'd have discussions during the winter, not too formal, no restrictions on it, but we made a point of getting together, and this is good. But so I don't think that any of us felt particularly restricted or shut in even during these 9 months winters. So we always knew we could get out on the train anyway.
You were all CPR or park people?
Yes, there was one park warden and there was one storekeeper, and everyone else was CPR. Strictly a company town in that sense, although I never had the feeling of a company town, really. In fact, I don't think it ever occurred to me. It also, in fact, was more than anything, too, I suppose, a park town, because the National Parks Administration were pretty huffy about anybody moving in there. They don't want people, they want animals. So now I understand this, but I felt a little bit offended when I went there and then asked if I could get the lease. It's a year-by-year lease, ground rent, I think they call it, from a signal maintainer's helper who was leaving, so that I could live in the house that he was leaving. And the parks people wrote to superintendent of the CPR in Revelstoke and asked if it was really necessary for this man to live at Glacier. You know, they're pretty strict about it. Yeah, I didn't feel too beloved or anything like that, but however, it turned out all right. And after I'd been there for quite a while, probably because I was genuinely interested in the park, I was a mountaineer, and I got to know some of the people in the parks board and in the administration. Well, they tended to accept me, you know, as possibly as a necessary evil or something like that. But
well, just to finish up the railroad aspect before we get into the mountaineering, you're talking of winter. We never discussed the winter problems and what may be of operating through there. You had mentioned to me before some of the snow plowing that went on and some of the things that took place.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, this was quite fascinating. This was one aspect of my work that always delighted me. You know, it snows. Everybody knows it snows a lot in Glacier. The average snowfall, when I was up there, the average snowfall over about a 30 or 35 or 40-year period, which had been recorded by the CPR, was around 32 feet. Well, that's a lot of snow. It varies a great deal. I think it was the last year that I was there, it went up to 48 feet, and that's a lot. And what it actually means in realistic terms is that year, it began to snow in October, around October the 1st, and it snowed every day, an inch or 2 or 3 or 4 every day. It never stopped snowing until sometime just before Christmas, when the weather cleared up and became quite cold and bright. And this lasted for about a week or 10 days. Then it broke up in a big snowstorm, and it snowed every single day without fail from then until May the 1st or 2nd. Never one day that it did not snow. Well, in fact, as you can imagine, in order to get 560 inches or whatever it was of snow, it was way over 500 inches, you would have to have it snowing like that. This becomes a little oppressive because it just never clears up, and even for skiing it's rather hard because the snow is there's always soft powder snow on the top. However, this doesn't occur all the time, and this, of course, brings you to the railroading problems that are attendant on snow particularly, and in fact, I think it is particularly snow there. They don't suffer from falling rock, the rock in the Selkirks being good and solid, as they have suffered from falling rock and such like things in the Fraser Canyon part of the CPR. So it's mostly snow and the odd washout, you know, from mountain torrents that will, for some reason or other, dam up and then suddenly let loose and wash everything out ahead of them. But the snow is another thing. I mean, they've had some tremendous slides up there, and they're always having slides. I mean, there is, I don't suppose there's ever a year passes they don't have a few slides that cross the railway track. And after a heavy snowfall, anyway, there's always what we call slope slides. You know, the upper bank, which is often very steep, will just gradually, the powder snow will slide down the track and may pile up on the high side, 20 or 30 feet high. It used to be quite thrilling to me to see these big 5900 type locomotives, which on a passenger train would be both on the head end, you know, and they come driving into Glacier with snow piled right up over the headlight, right up on the boiler, you know, because they used to have what we called pilot plows on the front end, which were quite big, hefty snow plows, and they would drive right through a small slide. They never ease up at all. In fact, as soon as they saw the slide, I suppose the engineer would open the throttle a little wider. And they could do that if there were no big rocks or anything like that in the slide. The thing would drive right through with it. The train itself weighing around 2,000 tons, and the two locomotives together being about 600 more tons. Well, they had a lot of momentum. But oftentimes, of course, you'd get a really big slide down, and then the whole railway would be tied up until they could clear it, which they used to do chiefly with what we call wing plows. You know, it's just a plow that, well, that's all. You have a plow that you shove through the snow and it casts the snow off to one side. They also had what we called rotary plows, which had a big bunch of blades on front. You know, it was immensely heavy, and the whole thing was heavier than a locomotive anyway. And it had a boiler of its own. It wasn't self-propelled, I don't think, but it had a boiler to run the rotary part of it, and it would throw snow an immense distance. But unfortunately, too, it had the tendency to throw its blades off, too. And they were forever breaking down. I've seen two of them on a slide. And the first one broke down as soon as it got there and was no further use. And the other one broke down shortly afterwards. And, of course, then the problem is you have to pull them out and pull them back to a siding and waste a lot of time till the wing plow can get in there. But a few years before I left Glacier, they used the first bulldozer on the snow slide, and this is very effective, and this is the best way. The bulldozer, I mean, can go all over and it gets on top of the slide, whereas the wing plow, you just have to drive it into the slide at the track level. And some slides can be very high. I remember a slide that occurred between Illecillewaet and Downey, was it? No, it was between Illecillewaet and Laurie Tunnel, I guess, yeah. And this slide actually was over 50 feet deep. That's tremendous depth, you know, and of course, especially when you think that the snow becomes packed almost as hard as ice. To cut your way through that, it's quite impossible to drive a plow through it. To cut your way through it, it just simply means handwork and also dynamite and blasting, and this takes a lot of time. So I think the bulldozer was the answer to a lot of their slide problems. Because then there are other things about slides which are quite fascinating. One of the things that used to fascinate me was the wind blast from the slide, which I was telling you about before. I think that slide at Ross Peak, you know, where the freight train had come out of Ross Peak. And I was working, in fact, I used to get a signal on the panel of the electric switch when the train came out of Ross Peak, and the light would flash and the bell would ring. So it would be about 8 minutes or so before it got up to the electric switch, and you know, you'd had the switch lined up for whichever track you were going to bring it up. This train got out of Ross Peak, but it never got anywhere. It didn't get any further. It never got the switch. And as it happened, a powder slide had started up from the ridge of Ross Peak, just before the train was passing, I guess, or just as it was passing. And it came down. The slide itself didn't cross the Illecillewaet River, but the blast of wind which preceded the slide crossed it, and it blew two cars right out of the train which was passing. Just overturned them and blew them right off. And of course, then the train naturally stopped. The emergency brakes went on, and there it was until they got some help and take the cars out of the way and put the train back together again, which was quite a while, of course. But this blast is terrific. I mean, I've seen many, many instances of trees, you know, that haven't been touched by the snow, at least 1.5 feet thick, being snapped right off, sort of mown off at the snow level. And it's quite frightening to see what it can do. Unfortunately, there are not very many people around when such things happen. In the big famous slide of 1910, you know, which precipitated the CPR's idea of building the Connaught Tunnel so that they wouldn't have to go over Rogers Pass anymore. This is I think it was March the 10th, 1910, when this slide came down at the western end of Rogers Pass, and were 65 people buried in it and killed. But Joe Butterworth, a real old-time resident, and others have told me that there was a fireman, and I don't remember whether he was a fireman on a rotary plow or on an engine, but I think it was an engine, who was actually blown by the wind out of the path of the slide, and he picked himself up later on. I don't know whether he was knocked out or something, and he was dazed anyway, on the fringe of the slide, quite a long ways away from the track. Very lucky for him, because everyone else was killed. Everyone else was buried, in fact. it buried the whole train, and it's.
You mentioned too the dexterity of some of these plow operators.
Oh yeah, this was the wing plows. Well, they had to be. You can imagine taking advancing on a slide which is about 3 times your own height, you see, and which is absolutely solid, more or less like a brick wall. And you have this rather small little plow. You see them; they're short, and you're up in this sort of steel cage in the thing. And the engineer behind you is driving a great big 325-ton 5900 class locomotive. Well, so if he hits it too hard, he's going to go off the track for one thing. He may even fold the plow off and do a lot of damage. So he's got to know how hard to hit it. And if he hits it too hard also, no matter what else happens, he'll drive the plow in so that he can't pull it back out again because the snow will come in behind the wings. So they developed a technique of sort of tapping at it. Well, locomotives are rather unwieldy things, but you could imagine, let's say, trying to tap at something, hit it and draw back in an automobile. That would be pretty hard too. With a great big 325-ton locomotive, it seems almost incredible that they could do this. Hit the thing and bounce back, hit it and bounce back. Well, what they did was they'd take a run at it at a prudent speed, no doubt, and before the actual impact, they put the locomotive into reverse so that by the time the locomotive actually hit it, the wheels were turning in the other direction, and then it would sort of bounce back. And these men became very adept at it, and of course it was, I imagine, quite a disgrace if a fellow actually shoved his plow in there and got it stuck, so it had to be dug out. But they would just tap, tap, tap away at this thing, and eventually they'd put a path right through it, These paths through the snow slides were pretty narrow. There was about as narrow as they could be and get a train through, because one of the things that I always remember in winter time at Glacier was the train orders that we had out telling the passenger trains to take down their marker lamps, which project a little out from the side, between mile so-and-so or at slide between mile so-and-so and mile so-and-so, or something like that. Wherever there was a slide, the clearance would be so narrow, especially on a curve, where the body of the car would swing a little bit. So they had to take down their marker lamps, or they just got wiped right off. They didn't waste much space, obviously.
You mentioned too, clearing the station platform.
Oh, yeah. There was a guy called Randy. He was on the regular plow crew, and I was there, and it was pretty wonderful. After a snowfall, of course, and you'd get a heavy snowfall sometimes, the whole railway yard would be covered with maybe 3 feet of snow or something like that, you see, and everything's choked up. But, it's pretty hard to do anything, throw switches or so on. So, it wouldn't be very long, of course, before the regular plow crew was there. Under ordinary conditions, if it didn't snow too heavily, there was just a regular plow crew on working out of Revelstoke. They would go east to Beavermouth one day and back from Beavermouth to Revelstoke the next day. Then on the eastern end of the mountain sub, there'd be another plow crew. But when it snowed more heavily than that, they would have to get an additional crew on too. However, in any event, this fellow Randy was on the regular crew. He was running what we call a spreader. When they're running, actually, they oftentimes have a wing plow and then a spreader behind it. But a spreader is simply sort of a flat car arrangement with a tremendous long arm. It extends out about 30 feet, I think, or maybe more. Very heavy, and it's just to spread the snow back. It's sort of a swept back wing idea. Well, this thing, the arm itself must weigh about, say 5-10 tons. I don't know. It's tremendously heavy. It has to be very strong, and it's operated by compressed air, from the airline of the train. And unless you're an expert, it's extremely cumbersome and unwieldy and slow and everything like that. But this fellow Randy could work it, so just like a surgeon's scalpel, sort of. After they finished plowing and spreading the yard, after they cleared all the tracks, they would spread the snow over away from the station towards the center of the Y. And because the way they do it would be to work, mostly they would work from the west portal of the tunnel westward, which is slightly downhill, and they take a run at this thing, and with this long arm out, and of course the snow will go flying in a beautiful curve way up in the air and land about 40 feet over on the next track. And then they'd work their way down across the parallel tracks until they got it through it, right away from all the tracks in the center of the Y. After they did that, then they'd go down the westbound main line, which was adjacent to the platform, to plow the station platform. And this happened just about every day, or every second day anyway. Well, Randy would come along there with his wing out, and he'd plow the platform right down to the boards, that's all. And then he'd plow all the contours of the station. Stations generally have a big bay window, so you can look out and see the trains coming, you see. And he'd come along with this wing going about, I'd say about 8 miles an hour. And if he ever made a mistake, he would have wiped the whole part of the station right off. But no, sir, he'd follow the contour of the station about 3 inches away from it and just pull the wing back and go right around this bay window, Just to scare heck out of me when I first saw it. But he'd just do that. It's wonderful, This skill that people develop, whether they're carving gargoyles in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris or running a snowplow. It's the same kind of highly developed skill. I've never seen anybody who could do it as well as he, though.
You mentioned once you filled up the section house, too, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think this was a little malicious. There used to be a watchman at Laurie Tunnel, which is probably the most godforsaken place anybody can live, because it's in a deep canyon-like place. I don't think they get any sunshine there for more than about 3 weeks of the year, It's fantastic. And this chap who lived there, well, he lived there with his wife, and everybody, sort of felt an unspoken sympathy for him for having lived in such a horrible, bloody place. Well, Randy came along one evening, and for some reason or other, he didn't he was running a snowplow. They were plowing the main line, and they were really running maybe 40 miles an hour or something like that, which throws snow a long ways. And he had the wing of the wing plow out. The wing plow has a wing that you can extend, a very short one, not like the spreader. And just as he came up to this place, he put the wing out. Well, hell, this shoved the snow right through the damned house. I mean, it pushed all the windows in and everything like that, and for half filled the poor guy's house up with snow. He called me up on the phone, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. I mean, he called me up the next day. I wasn't there when it was done. By this time, Randy was gone, and so I don't know whatever happened about it. But I don't even know whether he intended it. But he was so darned expert that I always figured that he wouldn't make a mistake. Maybe. Number 21, TWONE, engine 5900, FIVNINENOUGHT, Glacier, period. Engine 5900, FIVNINENOUGHT, run extra Glacier, GLACIR, to Revelstoke, REVLSTOKE, GAD. 19, number 22, TWO, extra 5900, FIVNINENOUGHT, West, WEST, Glacier, period. Number 2, TWO, engine 5921, FIVNINE, TWONE, wait at Illecillewaet, ILLECILLEWAET, until 310, THREETN, 31 knot, 4 extra 5900, FIVNINENOUGHT, West, WEST, GAD. Well, about silk trains, and unfortunately they were all gone by the time I got to Glacier, but I do remember them very well when I first went to field and was even more enthusiastic about trains then than I was later on at Glacier. This was about 1929, and the first silk train I saw there was actually two sections of the same train out of Vancouver. The first section was about 15 or 16 cars in these box baggage cars, steel cars with passenger train wheels and with steam connections and everything like that so that they could run them in passenger trains. Well, it's quite exciting. I was out on the platform field when this thing came driving in. Usually the passenger train stopped at field for 15 minutes, so the men could tap the wheels and they could put ice in the cars and do all the things that they have to do at divisional stops. But this silk train came driving in with two big engines on it, ground to a stop, and they whipped those two engines off in about, a matter of about 60 seconds, and they pulled up, backed in down a track, and there were three engines waiting to be put on to go up the big hill out of field. There was, two 5800s and one 2500, 2500 being very light, a sort of racehorse type. The two 5800s are these old pushers that they originally got for work on the field hill, very squat, very heavy, very small wheels. They can't go very fast. And they would cut them off at Stephen, the top of the hill, and then let the train go down to Calgary with this 2500. The idea being, of course, speed with silk trains. Well, they whipped these two incoming engines off, and they backed down with the other three engines. In the meantime, there were carmen rushing up and down the train, tapping the wheels furiously, and policemen inspecting the seals on this precious silk, and other people flying around all directions. And exactly 3.5 minutes after that darn train was in there, the conductor gave the engineer a highball, and they started out, with a tremendous roaring, snorting, and puffing, and wheels grinding, and steam shooting out all over. And I was standing up by the leading pusher. The fellow who was on it was an engineer I greatly admired and feared called Guts Morrison. As his name implies, he was pretty big, pretty tough. And by the time the tail end, which had a passenger car on it, instead of a caboose, because it had been proven rather sorrowfully that cabooses were too light, they'd whip around the corner so fast that they'd often come right off, the speeds these trains travel. The tail end of passenger car on this thing went by me, and it was going, I would say it was going a good 30 miles an hour. I mean, it was too fast. It would have been impossible to grab it, and get on. So it must have been going about 30 miles an hour. And, of course, at the point where it started, it's just a few yards until you're right on this 2.5% grade because, that platform at field is flat. And the hill starts right there, and it goes up, and it's really a hill. That is, railroad-wise, anyway. But that was it. I mean, I thought it was terribly exciting, of course, then you could see it snorting up the hill. It was really going. I mean, I never saw anything go up that hill so fast. And I just had to imagine what happened after they cut the pushers off at Stephen and they started drifting down hill to Calgary because they really traveled. I mean, they made so much better time than passenger trains, and they must often have been going 80, 90, or 100 miles an hour, I suppose. Because according to an engineer who was driving a silk train in the Fraser Canyon many years ago when, I don't know whether there's 2, 3, or 4 cars of silk came out of the train and went down in the canyon and spilled bales of silk all over the Fraser. He figured he was going about 80 when the master mechanic kept insisting that he go faster. And so he said, okay, I'll go a little faster. And of course the result was that the cars behind the engine just whipped out of the train. Fortunately, the engine didn't come out and no one got hurt or anything like that. But it was rather sad about all the silk. They had hordes of Indians down there salvaging silk, which I think could be successfully done. It was wrapped in supposedly waterproof bales, and it would float too. So I don't know. This was just a story. I remember when it happened. I wasn't there, but I was talking to the engineer afterwards, a fellow named Snowden. Silk trains were pretty exciting, all right. I wish they still had them.
You mentioned one that went through Merritt and took out the water tank.
Well, again, this is another story. It actually happened, but I don't know the exact circumstances of it. For some reason or other, they had to make this profound detour, which must have pained them very much, inasmuch as silk trains were always trying to make the fastest possible time between the closest possible points. You know, they didn't want to stretch it out any because of losing time. But for some reason, they did have to make a detour from the main line and through Merritt. And of course, the Merritt branch was, it was just a branch of a branch, and I suppose more or less to logging railway standards, lighter steel and so on, and it just couldn't take the speed. So they came tearing up past the old station at Merritt. Just beyond the station, there is a very large Y, the main line being one leg of the Y, and a water tank sitting in the Y near the main line, just beyond the switch. Well, it's on a curve, and they just didn't make it. The train was going too fast and sort of started to straighten out the curve, and it went right through the water tank. It must have been very interesting. I don't know whether the tank itself all fell down on the train or just what the hell happened. It's rather an imaginative endeavor anyway. I think it could have been a wonderful mess. Fortunately, as I understand it, no one was killed, and I dare say there are a lot of hurt feelings, though. Rather strange in railroading, you know, except for real disasters like the Rogers Pass slide, which, as I mentioned yesterday, killed 65 men, most train wrecks don't tend to kill people indiscriminately. I mean, certainly railroading is much less lethal than motoring. And these tremendous engines, for instance, I've seen them turned over on their side, you know, in the yellow silhouette between Glacier and Revelstoke. This happened fairly frequently, and I've known men to be in them and when they've turned over, and rarely does anyone get killed, and rarely does anyone get badly hurt, if hurt at all, which is rather amazing, you know. They didn't have seat belts. Probably the secret was they didn't go quite so fast, and when they came to a stop, they tended to come to a rather gradual stop, you know.
Just because they were getting small slides or something?
Yes. One instance I do remember. At Glacier one morning, I cleared two pushers. They came up there on two different trains. I think it was two passenger trains, number 4 and number 8 probably. And the two pushers came in to get their orders, so we coupled them up together and sent them back to Revelstoke as one train, you know, which is a good idea. And while we were there, one of the engineers, Doug Fraser, whom I was talking to, somehow we got on the subject of the Cutbank Bridge, which had collapsed in 1928, when two pushers coupled were going across it. He, at that time, was a fireman, not an engineer, and he was on the leading engine, and he told me that they could feel the bridge going, and the engineer opened the throttle. Their engine got across to the east end safely, and the engine that was coupled to him went down with the bridge and killed the two men, I believe, that were in it. I think I'm sure they were both killed. Doug, fortunately, was on the first engine. So we were talking about this, so I cleared him this day, and I said, well, I hope you don't go over the bank today or something like that. And sure enough, they got down, I think it was somewhere between Illicilloit and Downey. Before they got to Albert Canyon anyway, they ran into a snow slide, wet snow, and there were some rocks in it, and the two engines climbed up on the rocks and tipped over. Well, Doug stayed, he was on the leading engine, he stayed with the engine. The fireman decided to bail out, and he bailed out onto the slide, which was still, as it happened, moving, and it carried him down underneath the second engine. And he was lucky, though. The whole thing just stopped, and his leg was across the track under the driver, and his leg was pinched a little bit. It was that close, but he got out. He was a very lucky guy. But, that was a particularly bad place down around there. All slides coming down. There's one place, a slide comes down, you can see it when you go by on the track. It's on the mountain on the north side, and it must be at least 5,000 vertical feet up to top. And there's always a big cornice on the top, which you can see quite clearly from the track. And it's just a chute, bare rock, there's nothing else in there. Well, this slide comes down, and into the Illecillewaet. At that point, the track is on the south bank of the Illecillewaet, I would say 200 feet above, 200 vertical feet above the water, maybe a little more. And the slide will come down across the Illecillewaet, up the other side, and in one instance, I remember, curled around, came back and took part of a train back down into the canyon. And this is a very bad place because there are always slides coming down there, always will be. It's protected to some extent by snow sheds, but then the slide doesn't always come in the same place. So one of the extra gang foremen, their Italian chap, told me he had worked on slides at that place many times, when they were so high that they had to do a lot of digging and blasting by hand because plows wouldn't touch them. And he said that they used to oftentimes would find fish in the snow, in the frozen snow, the compacted snow ice that had been scooped out of the Illecillewaet when the slide came down. I mean, this sounds like a fake story, all right, but I believe it. It's true, because obviously when the slide comes down, it hits the bottom with tremendous impact, and of course it must just wipe the water out of there, take it up with it. But
you weren't around there in that bad time of 34, was it? When the breakaway?
No, I wasn't there. And by the time I got there, I remember those days. I was sort of floating around on the periphery of railroading, and I used to go up to field, stay with a friend of mine who worked in field then. So I knew all about these things and talked with people who had been there. But I wasn't there, and that was a very bad year. They had terrible slides there, and of course this one you mentioned was one of the worst accidents that they had because there were so many men killed in it. But you know what happened. Shall I tell you about it? I mean, well, what happened was, let's go back to the beginning. When I got there, the track was on the other side of the river, on the south bank of the Illecillewaet, because where this terrible accident happened on the north side, there were almost continual slides all winter long. It was a very bad place. So after this accident, I think they decided, something like after the big Rogers Pass disaster, they decided to build a tunnel. After this accident, they decided to divert the track onto the south bank of the river, where it's now reasonably safe. They've never had any such slides since. But at that time, this area is between Illecillewaet and Downey. And a westbound train came along, slide came down, or either just before it got there or while it was going past or something anyway, the engine got buried in the slide. So when they got around to rescuing things, they were working from the east end, from the field end, and they pulled the train back, of course, to Illecillewaet and, got that out of the way. Well, the engine was so deeply buried that they had to dig it out. They had an extra gang there, and they had the auxiliary crane, or hook as we call it, there, and they had started the process of digging this thing out, which meant that there were a bunch of extra gang men in a huge cut of snow, of icy snow. And one always has to remember this stuff isn't much like snow. After a slide comes down, of course, it immediately gets about the same consistency as cement. And they were digging away, and night fell, and everybody's working there. They had a bunch of men in the cab of the engine, and they disconnected the engine from its tender. And they brought the crane, the hook down, and decided to pull the tender back to Illecillewaet to make more room for retrieving the engine, digging it out. And in order to do this, they couldn't couple onto it. They had to chain the back end of the tender to the hook of the crane, which is what they did. They did it with a cable, I believe. They just put this cable over the hook or something like that. And the conductor who was there, Bruce Calder, told me that he had expressed misgivings, about the safety of this thing. He said, well, what will happen if the train dragging this thing back stops for any reason or other, or pauses, and the slack will run in, perhaps the cable will drop off, and there's no brake on this tender, it will run back down this steep 2% grade. So the man who was in charge of it said, oh, we can't waste time with things like that. Get it out of here, get it out of here. So away it went. It's dark, of course, you must remember. There was a trainman riding on this tender, and they got back up a mile or two or three or something like that, towards Illisillet on the steep grade. The engineer who was dragging them back evidently thought that he heard another slide, or for some reason or other he applied the brakes. The tender ran in, the slack ran in, and the cable dropped off. And of course, immediately this tender started to go right back to where it came from, and gathering speed very quickly because it was a very steep grade. And so the engineer eventually started to follow it down, blowing his whistle as hard as he could, but nobody knew what it was all about. So this tender was here, charging down westward down the hill in the middle of the night with a trainman on top of it. It was impossible to stop, and all these poor people in this narrow cut. Well, there's nothing could be done about it, and the tender drove right into the cut, and it killed, I don't know, it was a dozen, I think, or 14 men. There were a lot of others who were badly injured. Drove the engine, I don't know, about half its own length again through this ice. It must have been a horrible mess. And the poor fellow that was riding on the tender could have jumped off, and he should have jumped off. And I don't know why he didn't, but he didn't make up his mind to jump off until they got to the one place where he would kill himself by jumping off, which is crossing a bridge over a subsidiary creek running into the Illisillet. And it's a very high bridge. In fact, it's a very beautiful bridge. If there's any virtue in killing yourself at a beautiful place, it's one of those old stone arches, and it's still quite obvious there. It's extremely graceful. That's exactly where he jumped off. Instead of landing in a snowbank or something, he landed way down the side of the Illisillet, about 200 feet below, and of course he was killed. So the whole thing turned out very badly. And I don't know, just one of those terrible events.